This video examines the story of Samson's death, from the time that he was captured by the Philistines until his death. The Bible describes at length the events that led to his downfall. This includes three major parts. The first Philistine event was jubilation at the temple of their god Dagon, which consists of two short rhymes which appear in poetic form. This was followed by Samson's plea for God's help in the destruction of the Philistines' temple. The last part mentions Samson's burial. Examination of the Philistines' rhymes reveals that they ascribe Samson's downfall to their god, which adds a religious dimension to the story. Samson was the only person whose death wish was granted. His death wish is similar to other death wishes from the ancient world. The mention of his burial and its location links the end of the story to its beginning, which is the story of his birth. Samson was a unique judge, unlike any other mentioned in the book of Judges. Thus, not surprisingly, even his death was described in exceptional detail. The last part of Samson's life is narrated in Judges 16 verses 23 to 31. This section can be divided into three parts. 1. Verses 23 to 27 that describe the Philistines' jubilation at Samson's fall. 2. Verses 28 to 30 Samson's revenge and his death. 3. Verse 31 the burial of Samson with a formula ending. Hence, in the current paper we examine each of these segments. We will study the Philistines' jubilation. In his prayer, Samson expressed a death wish. Therefore, we judge it against other death wishes and their outcome. Samson's desire to die was compared to some of the fables from ancient times. Finally, we describe Samson's burial and the special language that was used to describe it. Was there any significance to his burial site? In addition, our main goal is to rediscover the last part of Samson's life. In order to achieve this goal, we will use a synchronic method analyzing chapter 16, as it stands. Material found in the Talmud, the Midrashim, and Jewish medieval commentators will be reviewed. Everything that Jews thought for more than 1,000 years can be found there. We still can find that they compromise between the literal and the midrashic. This, in turn, will shed more light on the persona of Samson. The Philistines' jubilation. Samson was brought down to Gaza where he became a mill slave in prison. It has been suggested that the image of grinding is a euphemism for sexual intercourse, Job 31 verse 10, Isaiah 47 verse 2 to 3. The defeated enemy performed sexually for the winners. Before describing the Philistines' jubilation, the video starts with a report that Samson's hair started to grow, which hints at the rejuvenation of Samson's power. Hair cutting and shaving indicate transformation in the Hebrew Bible. Samson's loss of hair points to a critical juncture in his life, as does its regrowth. In spite of the hair growth, the author later stressed the fact that Samson turned to God in prayer, verse 28. Turning to God in prayer is similar to the previous episode at En-Hakkore of Lehi, where Samson turned to God in prayer, Judges 15 verse 18. So why does the author mention the hair? It appears that by mentioning the hair, the author had two objectives in mind. Firstly, he connected our section with the segment of Samson and Delilah and the birth narrative. And secondly, he diminished the magical nature of the hair and instead showed the superiority of prayer. It was through his prayer that Samson achieved his last victory against the Philistines. The prayer shows his dependence on God. More so, it appears that Samson was aware of his faith. He turned to God to remember him and to give him strength for the last time. This is in contrast to the episode of En-Hakkore of Lehi, where the prayer was in the form of complaint and resentment. Here, he asks for God's mercy. By God answering Samson's prayer, the narrator shows that his powers were derived from God and he was a tool in the hands of providence. God's intervention in response to prayer appears in each of the major parts of the story. The Philistines celebrated their victory at the temple of their deity Dagon. Temples that are dedicated to the god Dagon existed at Gaza, Ashdod and Bethshean, Judges 16 verse 23, 1 Samuel 5 verses 1 to 7, 1 Chronicles 10 verse 10. Dagon was an important and widely worshipped deity in the ancient Near East. The Philistines adopted Dagon as their god after their settlement in Canaan. The fact that Samson was brought to the temple of Dagon, the god of grain, is ironic since Samson burned the grain and the fields of the Philistines. By bringing him to their temple, the Philistines ascribed Samson's downfall to their god, not to the Almighty. This was the case with Joseph, Gen 41, and Daniel, 1-6. In the Samson story the reverse is true. Samson is led from the dungeon to his death. Samson's revenge and his death are described in verses 28-30. Samson uttered a short prayer to God. He pleaded for God's help for one last display of strength that would help him take vengeance against the Philistines. In contrast to his first prayer to God at Ramoth Lehi, where he referred to God by the pronoun you, Judges 15 verse 18, here in his second prayer to God, Samson uttered the divine name twice, O Lord God. This divine title is rarely used in the Torah, Genesis 15 verse 2, 8, Deuteronomy 3 verse 24, 9 verse 26. It is used in a context of complaint, prayer and request. He asked God to remember him for the personal wrong he was suffering. In his plea to God, he asks to strengthen him. God has strengthened him in the past, now he asks him for the last time, and he would not trouble God anymore. Furthermore, he asks God to remember him. The motif of remembrance is recurring many times in the Hebrew Bible. It implies faithfulness to the covenant between God and his people. Samson is calling on God to act based on the special relationship he has with God, as he has been a Nazirite of God even before he was born. Since Samson's eyes were gouged, he asks for revenge on the Philistines, if only for one of my two eyes. 16 verse 28. In other words, the death of the Philistines would atone for the cruelty exacted upon him. Not clear, however, is why Samson mentioned only one eye. Why didn't he ask for revenge for the loss of two eyes? We find an answer in the Midrash. Araha answered, he begged from him, Sovereign of the universe, grant me reward for my loss of one eye in this world, and let the reward for my loss of the other one be kept ready for me in the hereafter. The narrator does not tell the reader that God hearkened to Samson's prayer, but his actions show that his prayer was answered. Samson grasped the two main pillars that supported the roof, and then bending forward, he forced them out of the perpendicular. Feeling that he had regained his strength, he said, "Let me die with the Philistines," verse 30. This is not a request, but it is a cheering cry that resulted in the death of thousands of Philistines. Usually people achieve more during their lifetime, but with Samson we find the reverse. The measure of Samson's success is the number of casualties he inflicted on the Philistines. Samson dies according to his own wish. Samson's desire to die has been compared to some of the fables from ancient times, in particular, the fable of the wasp and the snake. In his first prayer to God, Samson asked for his life and he was revived, Judges 15 verse 18. By contrast, his second prayer asked for his death and his wish was granted. This is the only time in the Hebrew Bible that such a wish was granted. We read about Moses, Numbers 11 verses 10 to 15, Elijah, 1 Kings 19 verse 4, Jeremiah, 20 verse 17, and Jonah. However, God refused these heroes' requests and they continued with their mission. According to the Gemara, the reason for Samson's harsh punishment is because Samson rebelled against God through his eyes, as it said, and Samson said unto his father, "Get her for me, because she is pleasing in my eyes." Therefore the Philistines put out his eyes, as it said, and the Philistines laid hold on him and put out his eyes. It is noteworthy that when David is chosen to be the king of Israel, God said to Samuel, "For not as man sees, does the Lord see. A man sees only what is visible, but the Lord sees into the heart." 1 Samuel 16 verse 7. In other words, God can see all, but man's vision is limited. Ironically, as long as Samson could see, he was blind to his own deeds. It was only when the Philistines put out his eyes that he became aware of his weakness. Still, the sages tried to balance the harsh verdict that Samson received by saying, Rav said, Samson said before the Holy One, blessed is he, Master of the universe. Remember for me the 22 years that I judged Israel, and I did not even say to them, bring a staff for me from one place to another place. It was noted that this midrash is similar to Samuel's speech, whose ox have I taken, or whose ass have I taken? Taken a bribe to look the other way. 1 Samuel 12 verse 3. Samson says further, as recorded in the Gemara, that he had been careful not to accept bribes. Therefore, the loss of the eyes could not be attributed to bribery, which blinds the eyes of the wise. Deuteronomy 16 verse 19. More so, the Midrash praises Samson for acting alone in his wars and not using his people. The burial of Samson. This is the first time that we hear that he had brothers. It shows that they respected their brother. Alternatively, mentioning brothers refers to Samson's family. As for his father's household, this refers to the rest of his father's tribe. The verse that ends the Samsonite cycle brings us back to the beginning, the story of his birth. As Samson was passive in his birth, so he is after his death. His family members are acting here and burying him. The family buried Samson between Zorah and Eshtaol at the tomb of his father Manoah. Hence, signaling reconciliation between the family and Samson. By declaring the site of his burial, the story returns to the opening stage of our story. There it says that the Spirit of God seized Samson between Zorah and Eshtaol. As in the Samsonite story, an identical site for his election and burial appears also in the Gideon story. Gideon and Samson were elected and died at the same site. Hence, Gideon was elected at Ophrah of the Abiezrites, the place where he was later buried in the grave of his father Joash. By mentioning Zorah and Eshtaol, the video not only integrated the introduction to the rest of Samson's story but also into the following story. There is a final note that says that he judged Israel for 20 years. A similar statement had appeared already at the end of chapter 15. According to Abravanel, the statement in chapter 15 refers to Samson's spiritual demise, which began at that point, but when mentioned in our chapter, it refers to his physical death. 16 verse 31. It was first mentioned after his exploit at En-Hakkore because it was there that his downfall began. Until that time, he had enjoyed God's help, but from that point on, he began to stray from temptations and his end was a matter of time. Hence, the statement in chapter 15 refers to Samson's spiritual demise, which began at that point, while the mention in our chapter refers to his physical death. Noteworthy is that the sages believed that Samson's judgeship lasted far after his death. According to them, his frightening memory held the Philistines in check for another 20 years. The Bible says at the end of the other judges' lives that the land was tranquil for 40 years, not so with Samson because he did not complete the deliverance of Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Conclusion. As a judge, Samson failed to carry out the mission that was assigned to him by God, and he brought destruction upon himself. His demise is described in minute details, which is not found with the other judges. The Philistines' jubilation of the capture of Samson is expressed by a short utterance with repeated rhythm. In his prayer to God, Samson expressed his wish for death, which is different from his first prayer for victory. He ends his life in dramatic fashion, which resulted in the death of thousands of Philistines. Samson is the only one in the Hebrew Bible whose death wish is granted. They buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol at the tomb of his father Manoah. There it says that the Spirit of God seized Samson between Zorah and Eshtaol. Thank you for watching. Like, share and comment. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos.